Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about survey research. We're going to start with a brief overview of the importance of survey research in the field of criminology and criminal justice. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of the lecture going in depth into survey construction or questionnaire construction. And this will include talking about the specific constructs and variables that a standard survey should include, as well as some of the key things to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we're going to construct our questions or our items of that survey or questionnaire. The readings for this lecture is Chapter 9 of your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. So surveys are one of the most frequently used measurement approaches in criminal justice research. Why is that? Well, with a survey or a questionnaire, you can collect a large amount of information from people at one point in time. So you can measure a lot of constructs in a survey that's got 10, 15, 50, 100, 200, 300 questions in it in a much shorter period of time than doing in-depth observational research or experimental studies or other studies that may require collecting physical information. You're just asking people questions. But in order to make sure you have that valid and reliable data, those validity and reliability, those terms are going to come back to us all throughout this course. You want accurate data and you want to make sure people are responding consistently, right? That's the reliable component. So in order to make sure you do that with survey research, you want to think about three things. First, you got to think about survey construction. And to go along with that, we can look at what it says here, that the use of well-designed survey instruments or questionnaires improves the quality of data we collect. Okay, so that's what this lecture is going to primarily focus on, is how do we construct a well-designed survey? Because you can imagine we want accurate and consistent data. We want valid and reliable data. But with a survey, people can lie, or people can get bored and tired and then stop paying attention. People can be confused by the questions if they're not clear. There's all sorts of things that go into considering how we construct that survey. And that's the first step. Without a good survey, no matter how much data you collect, it's worthless to you. Once your survey is constructed properly, the next step is sampling. And this is where we'll think about what is the appropriate sampling strategy to use for any particular situation. And we'll be talking about this in more detail as we go forward in our future lectures. And then finally, we think about, with survey research, the data collection approach. How do I administer the survey? Is it paper and pencil? Do I do oral interviews with people? Do I do it via computer or texting or something, or a telephone data collection approach? So both sampling and data collection are going to be really important, but we're going to save those for a later lecture, because the first thing we need to make sure of is that we have a well-constructed survey. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So the rest of this particular lecture is going to be broken down into these two main points. How do we select the constructs that we're going to operationalize into variables that we want to include within our survey? And then also, how do we design or construct our various questions within the survey itself? So let's get started with point number one. So selecting the constructs or variables to include. Well, there are four main types of variables that a standard survey will include. The first two are going to be the way that we operationalize our exogenous construct, that causal construct. So when we operationalize an exogenous construct, that creates our independent variables, right? So once again, as a review, remember those constructs were abstract ideas. In order to collect data about them, we need to operationalize them into something that is concrete and measurable, and that's what the variables are. So we need to have questions that measure our key independent variable, or variables if we have more. On the other side, we also need something that operationalizes the endogenous or the outcome construct. And these are operationalized into our key dependent variables, our outcome variables. But just because those are our primary pieces of our research question or hypotheses, We also want to include other types of variables within a good survey. And this is so that after we've collected our data, we can oftentimes get a better idea of what our sample looks like. Who are the people who responded to our survey? So we can think about, is it a representative sample, or who does it represent? What population might it apply to? And also, when we get into the statistical analysis, sometimes we want to control for other variables. And this goes back to those steps and criteria for establishing causality. And you may recall the third step was ruling out rival explanations or ruling out rival hypotheses. That's where what we're going to call control variables are going to come into play. So what we have here as we have the demographic variables. This gives us an idea of who our sample is, who are we working with, and what population might they represent. And then also control variables. These are questions about things that may influence either the cause or the effect, the independent variable or the dependent variable. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of those in a bit. So let's use, for the rest of this lecture, sort of a background. Just a background example. So let's imagine that I'm doing research within prisons. And one of the things that I want to argue for is to have funds and an effort for inmates to participate in programs, whether they be educational programs to get their GED or get some college education, vocational education, right? Maybe job skills training or learning a trade, things of that nature. Or maybe it's a religious program, Bible study, things of that nature. So I ask a question that says, does program participation influence the behavior of inmates while they're in prison? So you'll notice here in my research example, program participation is highlighted in purple. That's my exogenous construct. That's my cause. I am asking, does participating in these sort of positive skill building, soul building programs, does that actually have an influence on the endogenous construct, and that is the behavior of the inmates, right? You can imagine if you're working as a correctional officer or a warden or anywhere within the prisons or as an educator within the prisons, you want it to be as peaceful of a place and well run as possible. So you're always looking for ways, how do I make sure that the inmates are behaving in a controlled and positive manner, right? So we ask this question, does program participation influence the behavior of inmates in prison? So as in any research study, I typically take my research question and then I translate it into a testable, predictive research hypothesis. So in this example, you might imagine that I would say a hypothesis along the lines of inmates who frequently participate in organized programs while in prison will have better behavioral outcomes. So you can see that I've turned it into a statement and I've turned it into something with a directional prediction. I'm arguing that the more inmates have the opportunity to participate in organized programs, the better they're going to behave. So let's use that as we break down and think about the various variables we might include when constructing our survey. So to remind us, that exogenous construct that we saw in the research question itself was program participation. So program participation it's an abstract idea, like, okay, so somebody says, oh, I participated in programs. Well, that statement alone, if an inmate walks up to you and says, yeah, I participated in programs while I was in prison, you go, okay, but you don't know what type of programs, you don't know how often, you don't know what days or, the frequency, things of that nature. And so we need to operationalize it. So when we operationalize program participation, what we create is our independent variable. And so in a survey, oftentimes we're not just going to ask one question that fully operationalizes program participation. Rather, we're going to have quite a few questions within that survey that are trying to measure indicators of program participation. So on this slide, what we have are 3 examples of the types of questions you might see that are measuring program participation. So 1, have you participated in any educational programs during your time in prison? 2, how often do you attend a Bible study class? 3, Which of the following types of job skills classes have you taken? And you can imagine that number 3 would follow with some examples or like circle which ones you have participated in. Key thing to think about is when we are measuring the exogenous constructs with these independent variable questions, you'll notice I don't ask anything about the inmate's behavior. So even though my original research question was looking to see whether or not program participation would have a positive impact on their behavior, that's my research question. I am the researcher, or we are the researchers. The subjects that I'm asking the questions to, I don't care about their opinions about whether or not they think program participation impacts their behavior. No, I ask them one construct at a time. And that is one of the most important things to think about when you're constructing a survey. You don't want their opinions unless that is your research question. If your research question is, do inmates think that participating in programs will improve their behavior? Then yeah, you can ask them questions that merge both the exogenous and the endogenous. But if we're trying to show and prove that there is a correlation or there is a strong connection between program participation and behavior, I need to separate those two constructs when asking my questions. And I can't stress that enough. So as you're working through your assignments, thinking about constructing surveys on your own, always keep that in mind. Focus on one construct with those questions at a time. So if you look once again at all 3 of these example questions, you'll notice they are only asking about program participation, period. Let's move on to the endogenous. So the endogenous construct, now I do get to look at inmate behavior, right? This is the second thing I want to measure. And this is the endogenous construct is operationalized with questions that measure our, what we're going to call our dependent variable, which is inmate behavior. So once again, I've got just 3 random questions that I threw up here that kind of measure various types of behavioral characteristics we may want to consider. So number 1, how many physical altercations, aka fights, have you had with other inmates in the past 30 days, right? That's a behavioral outcome. Number 2, how many times have you received an official rule violation notice from, say, the correctional officers or the staff at the prison? That's a behavioral measurement. And then finally, which of the following illegal substances have you used in the past week while they're in prison? And yes, I hope all of us know by now that yes, drugs and alcohol and other things do make their way into prison. Okay, so you'll notice, not to beat it to death, but to give it an idea of it is, you'll notice each one of these questions, I'm not asking anything about my exogenous construct, which was program participation. No, I am only focusing on the outcome, which is their behavior. And the reason for this is after we collect all this data, statistically, we can then start to look for, do we see correlations in how the subjects responded to the independent variable questions? Are those correlated with their responses to the dependent variable questions? And that is what allows us as researchers to then show and prove that there is a strong correlation between our causal construct and our outcome construct. All right, let's move ahead. So the other 2 types of variables that a good survey should include are demographic variables and control variables. So demographic variables, as I mentioned briefly before, these give us an idea of what our sample looks like, right? Because the only way that I can go out and tell the world, hey, I found a connection between this causal construct and this outcome construct is to be able to say, well, who it applies to, what population of people is this, does it support? So oftentimes we will either finish or start a survey with demographic variables. And what are they? They're questions that reflect aspects of persons such as gender, age, ethnicity, city of residence, etc. Maybe it's like annual income. If we're dealing with inmates in prison, it could be about, which prison are you currently located at? What cell block are you in? So, what is your gender? What is your age? What race, ethnicity do you identify with? Things of that nature. These are questions that are usually very straightforward And people tend to be rather reliable and valid in their responses, because most of us know things as what our gender is, what our age is, what our ethnicity or race is, what city we live in, and things of that nature. But they're very useful to make sure we know who we are collecting this information from. Then the other thing, and this is the area that gets a little bit harder when you're constructing a survey, because you could go on for days. And these are the control variables. These are any variables or constructs that might affect either the dependent or independent variables. These are those things that oftentimes in the research that you'll hear known as confounding variables, things that are sort of muddying the water between the cause and the outcome. And once again, going back to our earlier lectures, when I talked about the criteria necessary for establishing causality, that third step was ruling out rival hypotheses. That's why we have control variables. So we have to think, well, what may have an influence on the connection that I'm trying to prove between my cause and my outcome? So if our cause is program participation and our outcome is behavior, I got to think what other third factor might sort of get in the way of that connection, or might have an influence on whether or not somebody has access to program participation, or may influence their behavior. So some of the things that for this example, I said, for example, if somebody is already given a prison work assignment, well, that is they're sort of ordered to do that sort of participation or that program. So that's one thing I might want to keep in mind. Or if they have a certain prison work assignment, that may limit their ability to participate in educational or vocational programs, right? And by prison work assignment, I might mean, do they work in the laundry? Do they work in the kitchen? Do they clean the bathrooms? Are they on the landscaping crew? A lot of the things that prisoners are assigned to. And you can imagine these things could have an impact on their ability to participate in other programs, as well as their behavior overall. What is their housing status or location, right? If you're in certain types of confinement, you may be locked in your cell for 20 plus hours a day. That's obviously going to limit you from getting into fights, so your behavior may be sort of impacted. And it's also going to limit your ability to participate voluntarily in programs on other areas of the actual prison setting. Whereas if you're housed in a minimum security area, you're going to have a lot more flexibility. So that's something I might ask. Their classification level, right? That's another thing. In California, inmates are typically classified into one of 4 different levels. So inmates at level 1 are already, we're going to assume, are going to be better behaved than inmates that are at 3 or 4, the higher levels. So these are all things that we want to keep in mind. And as I said before, the tough thing with control variables is you could go on for days thinking about all the little nuances that may impact that connection between program participation and behavior. But you've got to balance the length of any good survey. You don't want it too long, you don't want it too short. So oftentimes you look at the literature, look at theories, think about what has been considered, what has often been sort of that third thing that may get in the way of what my primary focus is. All right, so let's go ahead and move ahead. So now we move on to sort of the second part of this. And this is, well, now we know that we need to have items or questions within our survey that measure our key independent variable, questions that measure our key dependent variable, demographic questions, as well as control variable questions. Well, how do I write these questions? And that's what the rest of this lecture is going to focus on. So the first thing we have to decide is, do I want to phrase my questions in an open-ended manner or in a closed-ended manner? And don't overthink it, but open-ended is simply like the questions you see here. You'll notice, number 1, how many times a week do you participate in substance abuse counseling? And then there's just a blank space. Number 2, during your time in prison, have you been written up for breaking any rules? If so, how many times have you been written up? So what makes these open-ended? The key thing that makes these two questions, as well as the follow-up for number 2, open-ended is there are no answer choices provided to the research subject. So let me say that again. Open-ended questions simply means there are no answer choices provided to the research subject. So the research subject therefore just has a blank space to write whatever they want. So how many times a week do you participate in substance abuse counseling? If somebody knows, well, in my schedule, I go to substance abuse counseling every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they're likely to write down 3, right, in that blank space. Or they may say every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Or they may say, several times a week, a few times a week, right? You can see it allows for sort of the research subject to sort of put in whatever they want. Number 2, during your time in prison, have you been written up for breaking any rules? Most of us would go yes or no, right? But some of them go like, I don't know. So you might say, they say yes, no, I don't know. Other times it may be a little bit more blunt and say it's none of your effing business, something like that. I've seen a lot of response like that with open-ended questions. And then if so, how many times have you been written up? Once again, it gives them the option to write in whatever. So even though number 2 says, have you been written up for breaking any rules? It sounds kind of like a pretty simple yes, no question, but it's still called open-ended because we don't have circle yes, no, I don't know. We just simply have a blank space, which allows them to write whatever they want. So let's talk about the good news. So with open-ended questions, there's a couple issues from a researcher point of view. The key advantage, and I'm going to kind of keep it light with this, but the key advantage of using open-ended questions is that it allows for a variety of responses beyond the limits of specific answer choices. What did I mean by that? Well, I am not an inmate. I've been to prisons. I've spent a fair amount of time in prisons and jails, but I have what I like to call my fancy little prison ID, get out of prison card that I always make sure I have with me so that the guards will open the gates and let me out after I've been there for research or an interview or something like that. So because of that, because I've never been an inmate locked up in a state prison, I can't climb inside of their heads and know what the world looks like to them. So I, as a researcher, sometimes say, I don't want to predict their likely answer choices and provide them with a list of answer choices. Rather, I want the luxury and the freedom of them to sort of tell me the world through their own eyes. And this is, especially when you think about qualitative research and exploratory research, this is a big advantage of asking things in an open-ended manner because you'll get things you never thought about. I know when I've done drug research, both with prison inmates, former prison inmates, as well as the general public, sometimes we'll ask, what drugs do you typically use? And I, thinking to myself, I'm pretty smart. I can figure this out. We have, ecstasy, MDMA, marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You'd be amazed when I go out and conduct research, and we often have that little, even with closed-ended questions, we'll have that little other category, and they'll write in something. I'm like, I have no idea what that drug is. I've never heard of it, right? So I, as much as I may feel well-versed in that literature or the, the correctional system or the prison system or drug use literature, there's always going to be something that will catch me. A couple years ago, no one knew what fentanyl was and things of that nature, but now all of a sudden we hear it. So this is one of the advantages of open-ended is people will throw out something that you may never have expected, which is good from a sort of a qualitative exploratory point of view. But now I come back to the quantitative side of me. The quantitative guy in me, who is a statistician who likes things, just give me the numbers, is what I often tell my fellow researchers. Give me the data and then I'll run the analysis. And when I get to that, as a statistician, open-ended questions are tough because they're really difficult to quote unquote code and analyze, especially when people are giving you odd or abnormal responses. All right, so I may say something like, how many days a week do you exercise? Well, there's only 7 days a week, right? The last time I checked. And I've asked questions along those lines about how often do you do whatever per week? And, or how many days a week do you do film, whatever it is. And you'll get stuff like a little bit, rarely. Well, I can't code that into a number. Like, I thought I was being clear when I said how many days each week, but obviously when you give it to a research subject and they have the freedom to reply in an open-ended manner, some people are going to say, oh, rarely. Well, somebody who is talking about exercise, somebody who is an exercise freak and loves to exercise, rarely to them may be 3 days a week, right? Whereas somebody who hates exercise rarely means basically, I walk to get my mail each day and I call that exercise, right? So those become really difficult to code or analyze. Even when we've asked things like, how many felony convictions have you had? And I've had research where we've done this, and we tried it with an open-ended question because we knew it'd be all over the map. And you get people who respond everywhere from, giving you an exact number, because I don't know about you, but I think I would know how many felony convictions I've had in my life. But if you're a career criminal, maybe you don't. But we have people who say a few, more than I should have, or to things like, none of your effing business, things of that nature. So from a statistical point of view, open-ended questions can be limiting because if I can't code the responses, I got to dump them. And that means I'm losing sample size. And that's not a fun thing. So that's one of the things you got to keep in mind when deciding your question construction. Do I want that freedom of open-ended, or do I want to sort of pigeonhole them by providing answer choices? So that's, what do I mean by providing answer choices? That is closed-ended questions. So let's move on to looking at those. So closed-ended questions, as I alluded to just a second ago, simply means we give you answers and pretty much say, circle the one that best fits your opinion. And even if it's yes, no, I don't know, that's still a closed-ended question. Like, if somebody were to ask me, are you male? And I'm thinking to myself, yes. But if they give me yes, no, I don't know, then that forces me to be clear as opposed to going off and giving some sort of open-ended response. All right, so looking at these, which of the following types of programs have you participated in? And you'll notice here that we've got, imagine if you're working in an area, you've got to balance having too many answer choices with too few. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But so I've got three of, the standard sort of programs that are offered in prisons: educational classes, vocational training, religious groups. And then one of the good thing about closed-ended questions is you always want to have that other category when you're asking for a lot of these. That other is the catch-all, something that I may not have been able to do. And then you can kind of have a merged, closed / open-ended question where you have other and then you leave a space for them to write in something that you as a researcher may not have even thought about. Number two, looking at this, during your time in prison, how many times have you been written up for breaking any rules? Once again, you'll notice I've got a series of different sort of, times, so they don't have to come back to me and say a few or a lot. I'm forcing them to sort of pick one of these categories. Now, one of the good things about this is it forces them, looking at question number 2, is it forces them to pick one of these categories. But you'll also notice that there are gaps, especially between, the 1 to 5 times, the 6 to 10 times, 11 times or more. So it doesn't give me the specificity of responses that I might like. But you can imagine, I also don't want to have, during your time in prison, how many times have you been written up for breaking any rules? And then have answer choices that are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to, infinity. That does not work well for a survey. You've got to find that balance. And this is why there is a certain amount of an art. And there's books, I've read quite a few books and articles and studies about how to design the perfect survey. And the one thing I can tell you is no one completely agrees. For everything from the ordering of questions, to the selection of questions, to the word choice. This is why we look at good research. This is why we have pilot studies. This is why we have, we talked about content validity in one of our previous lectures. And with content validity, you often ask people to review your research measurement approach beforehand. People who know the field, they can say, Would this be an understandable research question? Are these the proper answer choices? So it's always sort of a give and take game, and it's why it's, a first draft rarely is going to be a perfect survey. That's why we practice with it. All right, let's move ahead. All right, so when we look at closed-ended questions, a couple of issues are, first, the main advantage, and this is the statistician in me speaking out saying, yes, thank you so much. These are really easy for me to code, right? I mean, this percentage of the respondents circled answer choice B. This percentage circled answer choice A. Woohoo, I'm happy, right? There's a lot of things that I can work with when we look at those closed-ended questions. But as I talked about before, it's sort of the opposite side of the coin. The disadvantage is there's a limitations in the freedom of the answer choices. And sometimes I want more specificity, or I want them to have the freedom to tell a story. Some people are going to answer a question in one word. Other people will write 3 paragraphs. So I have to decide what is my angle that I need to get the most accurate and consistent information available. All right, so these next few slides are going to talk about when we design closed-ended questions, we always have to keep in mind some of the major issues. So on this slide, we're going to talk about one of the issues. So with this one, what we try to get at is you want to have a fair variety of answer choices when you're doing closed-ended questions. So both question number 1 and question number 2 on this slide ask the exact same thing. How many times have you been written up for breaking rules? The limitation and probably the negative part of number 1 is there's only 3 answer choices. Well, as a researcher and a statistician, there's a reason why we use the term variables. Variables means variability, right? In order for me to analyze it statistically, more variability is better for me. There's a lot more, in its stats class we can talk about, there's a higher level of measurement. It opens the door to more statistical operations that I can do. When I have very limited variability in a question, there's not a lot I can do as far as, establishing associations between variables or things of that nature. So example number 2, exact same question, but you'll notice I've increased the number of answer choices. So instead of having only 3 answer choices, we now have 5. And that's what I sort of sum up on the bottom in the red there. Now the question is, people go, well, what's the perfect range? I'm a big believer that if I'm asking closed-ended questions, some questions, if it's a yes, no, I don't know question, then yeah, you're going to limit it to 3 answer choices. But for a lot of them, I'm a big believer in like the 5 to 7 answer choice range. Oftentimes, if you start getting much beyond 7 or especially past 10 answer choices, it just gets too much. And then you fear the possibility that they may start looking at it and go, well, I'm kind of this and kind of that, and you don't want them selecting 2 choices, right? Sometimes it is appropriate. You probably have looked at surveys in your life where it says ask you a question and then it says check all that apply, right? You go into a doctor's office for the first time and they say your family has a history of which of the following ailments, and there's like a page of them and it says check all that apply. That's different. And there's nothing wrong with having questions like that on a survey. I know when we did a research project, once again dealing with former inmates and their drug use patterns, we had a question like that. We said, which of the following substances have you ever used? Check all that apply. And that was fine because that was one of the things that we wanted to capture with it. But usually when you're designing closed-ended questions and that question is going to be one of your primary independent or dependent variables, you want to have 5 to 7 sort of answer choices there. All right, so another issue we have to deal with, or actually a couple issues on this slide that we think about when we do closed-ended questions is, let's look down at the red at the bottom first before we read through them. So first, one of the key things, and I've seen this even in professional surveys, make sure your answer choices correspond to what the question is asking. What I mean by that is, you phrase the question before you even decide what answer choices you're going to offer for your research subjects. ask the question to yourself in your head and think, what would be a logical response? And use that sort of verbiage or that language when deciding about your answer choices that you're going to put down. And in both of these questions, that's been done. And I'll come back to that. The second red bullet point says Likert style answer choices. So Likert style refers back to a researcher who I believe actually pronounced the last name was pronounced Likert, but no one seems to go with that, so they call it a Likert style answer choice. This just means when you're providing answer choices that have a range of agreement or a range of frequency. Very, very common in a lot of social science research. The TCU Criminal Thinking Scales survey that I shared with you previously, you'll notice they say, here is a statement, indicate your level of agreement. Those are all Likert style answer choices. So in number 2, you can see that the answer choices are that classic agreement scale, completely disagree all the way up to completely agree. So you kind of have this subjective level of agreement. Other times that Likert scales work is a frequency. How often do you whatever? And then it's never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often, right? So there's Likert style doesn't just have to be agreement, but it's whenever you have a range of values that sort of indicate agreement or frequency to some particular question. And then also the third red bullet point is the idea of are neutral answers necessary? And in number 2, we have that. Okay. So let's go back through each question and just one more time recap how they relate to each of these 3 red bullet points on this slide. So question 1, how satisfied are you with the educational opportunities available to you? Now you'll notice I would probably say those answer choices are a bit limited. Like I said, 5 to 7 would be more in the wheelhouse that I like to see. But even with those 3, you'll notice the question asks, how satisfied are you? And they make sure to incorporate the term satisfied, right? It's a natural sort of follow-up to that question. Looking at number 2, please indicate your level of agreement with the following statement. I am satisfied with the educational opportunities available to me, right? So this is same question. It's just a different choice in how we phrase it and present it to the research subject. So this is where you as a researcher would have to make the decision. So I am satisfied with the educational opportunities available to me. And you'll notice we have 5 different agreement options. Once again, the question is about indicate level of agreement, and the answer choices incorporate that agreement, verbiage. And it's got that Likert style answer choice. But the one thing about this one, completely disagree, neither agree or disagree, agree, completely agree, there's that neutral answer. What do I mean by a neutral answer? That middle answer choice for number 2, the neither agree, I guess it should be neither nor, sorry, my typo, neither agree nor disagree. You're giving your research subject the opportunity to basically be ambivalent, be like, I don't know, I don't care. Now, is that necessary? And for some research questions, people would say, yeah, I want to have a neutral answer choice there. Because some people may be ambivalent about it. They may not really care one way or another. They're on the fence. And for you, if you're looking at a question, you're like, yeah, a neutral answer choice where they're not one way or the other is a valid response, then keep it in there. But sometimes when you're asking research questions, you want your research subjects to take a side, make a decision. And when you're asking questions like that and you want to force people to go one way or another, you may want to consider removing a neutral answer choice. So that's just, there's not a right or wrong. It's more of, once again, you're an artist when you're creating a survey. And as a researcher, this is what you have to think about is, do I want a neutral answer choice or should I remove that opportunity? Let's move on. So for this particular slide, we're now looking at this notion of clarity and the concept of being mutually exclusive when we think about our answer choices. So let's go through each of these questions. So question number 1 asks, how do you feel about the job skills training program you're involved in? and it's got answer choices of very positive, incredibly positive, negative, incredibly negative, very negative. What's bad about these answer choices for this one? Well, it's the descriptors of the positive or negative feelings, right? It's the very and incredibly. And sometimes people fall into this habit of trying to make sure I want to have a range of responses. So I'm going to use some descriptive word like very, incredibly. Be careful about using that, or especially using multiple descriptors, because what you might think is pretty clear cut as kind of like a walking up a staircase, like this value's higher or higher, 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 or going in the opposite direction. This response is a more negative or more negative. Doesn't mean that your research subjects are going to feel the same way, right? Very and incredibly are rather vague. And which one's a higher level of agreement or which one's a higher level of feeling, which one's a lower, it's hard to ascertain. So you want to be careful about that. So you'll notice down in the red, I talk about clarity, and I say number one, it's unclear. So I wouldn't want to be using that very and incredibly too much. So that's why when you think about a standard Likert scale, that's why they say like, it's like one descriptor to go with it. It's like disagree and then completely disagree, right? They don't say then absolutely 100% disagree. They kind of keep it pretty standard. So avoid the use of too many descriptives or descriptors when you're coming up with your answer choices. Now let's look at number two. Number two says, how many times a week do you attend Bible study? Never, 1 to 3 times, 3 to 5 times, 5 or more times. Okay, this seems like it's quite a bit more clear. We see that stepping stone, right? Of never, and then the next one, 1 to 3, is a higher range, 3 to 5 is an even higher, and the last one's the highest range possible. So the clarity is there. But one of the problems with number two is it lacks a very, very important part of survey design. Those answer choices in number two are not mutually exclusive. What does mutually exclusive mean? It means you can't be in two answer choices at the same time. You don't want a research subject going, well, I'm kind of answer choice 2 and answer choice 3. No. You want to do your best because when you get the data back and you're doing statistical analysis, you've got to be able to code them, right? Are they an answer choice 2 or an answer choice 3? You've got to be able to figure that out. And you'll notice, and I've run across this a lot with surveys that talk about dollar amounts or frequencies, and they use numbers where they kind of have a little bit of an overlap. So you'll notice we go from never, okay, that means 0, no problem. And then the second answer choice, 1 to 3. So if you go 1, 2, or 3 times a week, that makes sense. But we get to answer choice 3. It starts at 3 and goes to 5. And so one person may go, well, that's fine because it's a higher value. But no, there's an overlap. Therefore, answer choices 2 and 3 are not mutually exclusive. If I know I go to Bible study Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's 3 times a week. So which answer choice would I have to choose? You don't want to, like I said earlier, I've said it before, you want your research subjects to read a question, not think too much, and just give the most quick, consistent, and accurate response they can. And you'll notice even the fourth answer choice, the 5 or more times, also has an overlap with answer choice number 3. So that's, with mutually exclusive, you want to make sure there's no overlap in the various categories of your answer choices. The other side, and this is another important one, so being mutually exclusive is really a thing you've got to double check when it comes to closed-ended questions. And the second big one is this notion of your answer choices being exhaustive. So let's look at the first one. Where did the last fight you were in take place? And the researcher has the yard, my cell, the shower. Okay. What's lacking about that? Those answer choices don't exhaust all possible places in a prison, right? Was it sort of in the cafeteria, the library, right? Other places. So one of the things you want to make sure of when you're coming up with your answer choices is make sure there's a place to circle or a selection for every possible person. And this is where that good old-fashioned, other category works nicely. So even though if you go and you talk with the warden and the correctional officer, you're saying, okay, at this prison, where are the fights taking place? They're like, oh, 99% of them take place in the yard, the cell, or like the bathroom area, wherever there's confined places with, little nooks and crannies and places to fight and avoiding cameras. And you go, okay, cool. I'll design my survey that way. Guess what? You're going to miss the, even the 1% of other options, and you don't want to miss out on those. So that's why for number one, simply having either a few more common places on the prison grounds or having that other category would help. And then number two, why is this also not exhaustive? You'll notice here, how helpful are correctional officers at preventing fights between inmates? Well, first of all, it's very limited in the answer choices, but very helpful, slightly helpful. And this was kind of an extreme example I did, but I hope it drives home the point. It's completely missing negative responses, as in not helpful at all, right? So you want to make sure that your answer choices, as you phrase them, whether it is specific sort of answer choices like locations, like in number one, or maybe it's like, what's your favorite food? And you got to list various things. Or if it's sort of a frequency or agreement thing, like a more Likert style, that's why it's so important that we cover the entire range of possible options. And that's what it means to be exhaustive. It means there's got to be a choice for everyone to be able to say, okay, that's what I want to pick off this menu, if that makes sense. All right, let's move on. All right, so the last two slides of this lecture are just kind of a couple wrap-ups about generally beyond some of the things we've talked about, what makes a good question, whether it's open-ended or whether it's closed-ended. And there's books, so more than just two slides that go into what makes good questions, but I'm going to hit on just a couple of the key ones we want to make sure we're understanding of. So what we have here is making sure that your questions are clearly worded and as concise as possible. And I use this example where you see the bad, the better, and the best. Now, I'm not saying that even the best choice of questions on this particular slide is the best possible. I think there's a lot of other ways we could phrase it, but you may, and if you disagree, that's fine. But the key thing we have to keep in mind is, how can I be as clear as possible with the question I've got and also keep it as short as possible, especially with a lot of the populations we work with, right? Do not write, even though all of us are college educated and beyond, you have a vocabulary and an ability to write that is going to be much higher than the individuals you're working with. We work with, kids with criminal justice research. We work with juvenile delinquents and adolescents. We work with adults who have reading levels of like fourth grade. So one of the things we want to make sure of is that we are being like even clearer and simpler than we would typically want to be, but we got to make sure we're actually getting the information. We don't want it to be so concise that it's vague, and this is a balance. So, and one of the things that I've noticed, and I've had multiple studies where we go into a prison setting and we ask people who are currently incarcerated, we want to ask them something about not their experience during this current incarceration. Rather, we want to know about sort of the prior times that they were in prison or jail. And that's a tough thing to start off a question. And so you can say, this is a question, we're talking about physical assault in prison. We start with the bad. Of all the times you have been in prison, but not including your current imprisonment for your last arrest, how many times were you physically assaulted? Now, technically, is that grammatically correct? And does it actually get at what we want? Yeah, but it's not clear, right? You read that question, that bad example, and it makes you think about when you're trying to like fill out your tax forms or something like that. You're going like, wait, what? And you're like, and a lawyer will come up to you and go like, well, it's technically correct. And you're like, yeah, but my mind is swirling trying to get through it. You don't want that with research subjects because they'll either just give up, skip it, get frustrated, all sorts of things that we don't want as researchers. So if I made an effort to sort of shorten it up and make it a little bit clearer, look at the better one. How many times were you physically assaulted in prison prior to this current period of incarceration? It's still asking the same concept, but it's shortened it up a little bit and hopefully made it a little bit clearer. But I imagine many of you are looking at that and going, Ryan, no, that's not much clearer to me. So then I try to do one better attempt. And this way I kind of set them up. And so this one I say, this question's only about your prior prison sentences. So you're sort of setting it up with a statement. And then I say, and I get rid of the whole physical assaultment and stuff like that, or assaulting. I say, how many times were you beat up or attacked? And then within here, once again, it's more concise. It's a little bit clearer. We're using simpler words, beat up, attacked. A lot of people can understand that more so than the phrase physically assaulted. But we would argue that, are we losing the specificity of what it means to have a physical assault by using these sort of colloquial terms like beat up or attacked? So that's sort of the idea. So once again, this is why it's so important to bounce ideas off of other researchers, administer the survey in a sort of a pilot setting to the subject or to people who sort of are of the same population and demographic as your target population, to get their feedback, to say, do they look at it and go like, I don't even know what question number 3 says. So that way you can go back and rephrase it and work with it. And let's move on to some other things about good. All right, so as we wrap up this particular lecture, 2 other things that we want to think about when it comes to what makes a question or questions good in a survey. The first one is the idea of asking only one thing at a time. So what's the problem with our first question? So the first question says, have you been arrested or convicted for a crime? And you go, well, that's pretty clear, pretty concise. What's the problem, Ryan? Well, the problem here is that word or in there. Whenever you are designing questions in a survey, the words or and or are problematic words to include, simply because immediately you're no longer asking one thing when you incorporate those types of questions or those words into a research question or survey question. The words and the word or all of a sudden create what we call in the field double-barreled or compound questions. So if I ask somebody, have you ever been arrested or convicted for a crime? They may say yes. But when we get the data back to the lab and want to analyze it, you can imagine we don't have much specificity, right? I mean, maybe all I'm caring about is people who have had run-ins with the law. And so I say, I want to keep it clear, so I just chose to write it this way. Fine. But if there's a noticeable difference between people who have been arrested and people who've been convicted, right? I mean, heck, I've been arrested. So, so if somebody has only been arrested, but was never convicted, if they're arrested, but then released or acquitted or whatever it was, that's a different population of individuals than people who have actually been convicted of a crime. So when you're thinking about that, you may think, okay, should I break this into 2 separate questions? Have you ever been arrested for a crime? Have you ever been convicted of a crime for any of those crimes? And you kind of have to find that thing. If it doesn't matter, if you're like, I don't care, if you're just interested in whether or not somebody likes, domesticated animals. So you say, do you like dogs or cats? And that's all you care about is, do they like domesticated animals? Then fine, you can have a double-barreled question. But it's one thing that as a researcher, you want to go back and check to make sure that you're not adding extra confusion into your research questions. And then our bottom one is you got to be careful about when you're, and this isn't just in the writing of the question, oftentimes it's in how it's being administered or how it's being asked. You don't want to be biased, or the legal term would, you don't want to be leading, right? You've heard the idea of like leading the witness in court. There, because you're likely to have an influence on the actual response, which is going to influence the validity of your response. So in this one, don't you think that a lot of inmates are victims of prison rape but just never report it? You can imagine this being brought up more in a face-to-face oral interview, more so than a paper and pencil, right? You would think there's ways that you would write it in a clear fashion if it was a paper and pencil type survey. But when we administer surveys, sometimes we do it over a telephone or we do it face-to-face, and you're trying to build rapport and get a conversation going. And as soon as you sort of lead them with like, yeah, don't you think a lot of inmates are victims of prison rape but just never report it? You're pushing for a particular response. So you always want to go back and think about, am I biasing or leading the research subject in how I am presenting the question? And this sometimes doesn't even involve the question itself. I've read surveys where they think, oh, we're going to ask some individuals about some, historical event and how it's led to political changes or things of that nature that are going on currently. And they go, oh, some people may not be very familiar with these riots or this particular, event or crime or massacre or whatever that happened historically. And so they'll start the survey with a little paragraph or two blurb describing some event. That's where you have to be really careful. You got to make sure that the event is described as objectively as possible. All sides are considered. There is nothing, you're not missing anything, because sometimes just the way you describe an event, that can bias people towards their feelings about it if you don't tell all sides of the story. So there is with a lot of these things, there's not necessarily a right or wrong. It's definitely a lot of gray areas, but this is a good introduction to how we start to think about breaking down a survey and the components of it when we're going to write one, design one, and administer it for our research studies. So take care. Have a good one.